This podcast is brought to you by JAM, Junction Arts and Media, building community in the Upper Valley through media.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Going the Dismas. I'm your host, Jeff Backus, and today I have with me Kathy Aston-Borski from the Vermont DOC, we'll say. I'll let you elaborate on that. And Cherry Sullivan from currently The Haven here in Hartford, White River. Kathy, do you want to just give us a little background who you are and, your career path that led you to your current position, which actually I don't know much about?
Sure. So I'm Kathy Aston-Borski. I'm currently the Director of Women's Services for the Vermont Department of Corrections. And I just started that role in April of this year. I've been with the department in various capacities for about 33 years now. And I started back in 1989 at the Woodstock Correctional Facility, which doesn't exist anymore. And it was interesting listening to Rita's podcast that she did, because that's where I first met her, when she was
really?
doing the Thresholds decision-making program, which was fabulous. From the facility, I went to probation, was a probation officer in Hartford for a while. Then I actually contracted with the state for a number of years and did a variety of different groups. I did a lot of domestic violence groups and the program that we used to use for people convicted of violent offenses. So from there, I came back to state service as the assistant superintendent at the Southeast State Correctional Facility.
Which is where I first met you.
Yes.
You hired me over there.
Yep. Good move on my part.
Yeah.
So I was there for 10 years, and then there was word that the facility was going to close. So I came back out to probation. Just recently took on this job as Director of Women's Services. So when I went to Windsor, it was initially to work with the women. So they were there when I came, and they left, I think, in 2009. They've been moved around the state quite a bit. But anyway, that was sort of the beginning of creating a deeper interest in working with the female population in our department. So taking this role on seemed like a good kind of culmination of the different positions that I've held.
And I think I want to talk about at some point the women's issues and the female incarcerated population, because that's something we should expand upon, and it'd be very good to lead into a conversation with the Women's House at some point. So that'd be good for our listeners. I think it's interesting. Are you happier in the field than you're in the facility? Because that's how I ended up at Dismas. Windsor was closing. I said, I don't want to go back to Springfield. So I found a position here, and, the rest is history. Do you prefer the field?
One of the things I've loved about working for the department is that I've really had a lot of different opportunities. And nearing the end of my career, I am thankful that I've been able to do both, because I think it helps have a broader perspective of, the people that we work with. And I guess ultimately, yes, I do prefer being in the field. It's always a relief after working in an institution for a while, that feeling of like being out in the open, and helps appreciate.
You feel confined yourself a little bit. Yeah,
definitely. And when you think of the folks that can't leave, and, that what that experience is like, it just helps, I think, deepen the appreciation for what their experience is.
And that's been my takeaway. When I arrived at Dismas, I thought people would resent me because I was in a position of authority in the facilities, but it was actually the opposite. People appreciated the residents. Appreciated that I've seen where they were.
Yes.
And I can, empathize a little bit.
Right. And Vermont being as small as it is, you've been doing this for a while now, that you really start to know families, siblings. On another one of your podcasts, there were two men that I think are currently at the house that both have concerns about their brothers and who have also been in the system. And doing this for this long, I, see those, you really kind of understand what's going on around the state and within our communities. And I think having the facility and field perspective deepens that.
All right, Cherry. So what's your story? How did you end up in Vermont? What's your career path? How'd you end up at the Haven?
I had been living in Western Mass for the past 20 years. And prior to moving up to Vermont, which I came to Vermont to be closer to family, I worked in the field of substance use disorder prevention, specifically as a coalition leader and convener throughout our community around addressing opioid overdose. And I saw a lot of intersections, of course, between substance use disorder and people experiencing incarceration, and saw many of the same issues with the systems that those people were experiencing, whether folks were incarcerated or not. And specifically, before I left, we started really to focus in on people who were justice involved, whether they were currently in the local jail or recently released, and thinking about what is it that the community can do better to help folks feel more successful, whatever that means for them, and of course, to prevent incarceration again. And of course, housing is one of those things that comes up over and over and over. And this is not unique to Western Mass or Vermont. It's a national issue. But particularly not just access to housing, but access to supportive housing. Knowing that people sometimes need a little bit more time to be able to get back on their feet, to help their brains heal, to work on trauma. And when I came to Vermont and I heard about Dismas House, I knew immediately I wanted to get involved because it was something that I had been hearing and seeing from the people we had been interviewing for that project and who had been sharing with us the concerns around housing. And so I actually connected with Jeff and was asked to sit on the council. So I've been on the council, I think, a little over 2 years now. Yeah, for Dismas House. And it's been an amazing experience to really see how something that, you know, when you think about big, large systems, Dismas is kind of small, right?
Sure.
One little house and one small community, but makes such a huge impact for the community, not just for the residents there, but I think for the community as a whole. I really think it makes our community more vibrant. It helps to break down stigma and stereotypes and shows that people really, truly are welcome and for who they are and where they are at.
And you also volunteer.
I was for a period of time. I haven't been lately. Once I started working at the Haven, I'm currently the director of shelter and clinical services there. Just my time was more limited, but I really have fallen in love with those restorative justice practices and how we can think less in a punitive way and more about bringing people in, showing more love than pushing away.
And Kathy, you worked with restorative justice as well, just as equally as much as Dismas. And we had Jonathan from Restorative Justice on this podcast. And this is leading into, I want to have a conversation, the two different housing styles. Restorative justice does a little bit of scattered site. We do, the group home style. What was your experience with the restorative justice approach to criminal justice?
I think I agree with everything that Jerry just said around, finding ways to resolve differences or conflict in a way that, brings people together. And that more often than not, people really do have the same goals, and that it doesn't have to be, coming at things from opposing sides. And I think that both restorative justice and Dismas House help show people that, and that skill and perspective is so important in sort of just people's outlook and relationship with others. And for a lot of the people we work with, they've never really had an opportunity to see things in that light. So what your question was about what the difference is. I think that just, I see both those housing situations, they're really programs. It's not just about housing, and that they both provide really needed support and guidance during that difficult transition of returning to the community.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I would imagine not a lot of people know that there is this partnership between the Department of Corrections and programs like Dismas to help refer people and filter people to a supportive housing model. And so, Kathy, I'd be really interested to hear from you, from your perspective, and then, of course, you, Jeff, as well, about the true value of this, right? Because we know it's so important. What gaps is Dismas filling? How does it really impact people's true being if it hadn't been there? What would it be like for people?
And I want to premise that with a lot of residents arrive on our doorsteps due to lack of approved housing. They don't have a safe place to go, which is one void we fill. And I'll let you speak a little more to Cherry's question.
Right. I mean, it's such an important space that and service that provides. Corrections is pretty straightforward. There's definite responsibilities that we have. And in that, sometimes it doesn't give the room for coming across as supportive and understanding. And I have loved the relationships that I've had in working with people from Dismas and with Community Justice Center, because together we can really hold people up and in a number of ways, because of course it is important that people on supervision are following the rules and doing what they need to, but having somebody at their side who provides a different kind of support I think makes an incredible difference. And, that those relationships go beyond their supervision time. And that says a lot right there, that they don't look at the support systems from Dismas and the Justice Center as just getting me through supervision. This is about learning a new way of being in the community.
Yeah. And, a lot of the residents that I've had over the years, I still am somewhat in touch with them long after they left. And I think that's pretty cool. It's just, family bond relationship that we've built. And I think that's one of the strong suits of Dismas. The Restorative Justice DOC Dismas meeting was my favorite one every month, because we actually changed the name of it. What do we call it now? It's the
that's right, transitional support.
Transitional support meeting.
Yeah,
and I think that really speaks to what we were trying to accomplish. So I thought that was pretty cool.
It's very cool. I mean, it provides. I think of when people get out of incarceration, and it makes sense that they miss their families. They want to go back to where they came from. But oftentimes that family, has long established issues that might have led that person to how they ended up being incarcerated to begin with. And so having a different opportunity and to be in a place where they can sort of start over in a different way and in a healthy environment. That's, when people get out of prison and we tell them, oh, you can't have contact with this person, you can't have contact with this person. And that's like that's who they know. That's where they're from.
And you tell them no, they want to do it more.
Exactly. That's so true. We have learned that over the years. But I think these other housing opportunities, give them a support system that everybody needs that, right? You need people that have your back and are presenting a healthy guidance and the
importance of community and feeling like you belong. I think this is kind of a good segue into one of your strong suits, Cherry, is addressing traumas. We're talking about getting people out of poor living situations and dealing with what they've always known and things that may have happened. Do you have any particular insights on, I don't even know if it's necessarily just childhood traumas, just traumas in general, things that happen to people? How do we help them work through it in a healthy way while they're also in flux from leaving jail?
It's a great question, and I think it's really complicated. I mean, I would want to first start off by saying I'm not an expert in trauma. It's not my specialty area, but I've worked with a lot of people with trauma and have thought about it from a public health perspective. And, I think one of the biggest pieces is trust and consistency, whether that's with the support that they receive at Dismas, whether it's the ongoing supports they receive from the Department of Corrections or probation, parole, their other providers, and also the community. I think in order to really help people see that they are worthy of a different way, we have to prove to them they are worthy of a different way. And we do that by showing up. I think we also do that by allowing people to show up who they are in that moment. So I think, one of the great models of Dismas and other programs that we're moving towards more and we recognize as very valuable in our community is a harm reduction model, truly meeting people where they are at, knowing people have to have a true desire to make change, and then they have to battle all the things they're up against when they want to make change. So recognizing that any individual is human, they'll make mistakes, they'll continue to learn, and that we aren't judging them for that we are still a safe place where they can land, that they can be open and honest about the challenges they're experiencing, which I think has been very true, Jeff. That's very much the tone that you have set at the house. And I think probably other houses have also set that tone. And making it feel like they have space to be the natural human beings they are, the imperfect selves that they are. I also think for various people, depending on their trauma, being able to get that stronger support from a mental health professional is really important. But I think when we think about the role that Dismas plays, it's really about that consistency, showing up, being authentic, being predictable. And it's okay to have boundaries and rules, but, finding ways to make sure people aren't necessarily punished when those boundaries or rules are pushed a little, I think are great ways to think about that.
I think we have made some headway in that regard from corrections perspective too, but that has also impacted our partners in the community that provide housing. But the last couple of years, we've undergone some changes in the department with justice reinvestment is what it's called. And it really changed our system quite a bit in terms of responding to things like relapse and low-level violations of behavior, where in the past we would have responded very quickly and very punitively. Issues of relapse. But as you say, it's part of the process, and we can't expect that people are just going to flip a switch and be able to turn that off. Our sanctioning process has changed in terms of how we respond to things, and are working with our community partners around housing that, we've working that out together with, if somebody does relapse, where in the past we might have just swooped in and taken them back to jail, that we try and work together on a better situation and solution and offer different opportunities for change.
Relevant to, traumas and however someone's life came to be, when we're trying to guide people to, try a different approach to life, change behavior, how do we negotiate the boundaries we keep on people? When, there's certain individuals, where I know they had something significantly happen to them in their life. And then I have had other people who are 55 years old and still blaming all their problems on their parents' divorce. How do we decipher and manage that? And, and this will stem into addiction management too at some point. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me is that it can be sometimes easy from the outside to sort of rate people's trauma on certain levels, and also assume that one person's life experience means that they should have more resiliency than maybe they do. And I think really recognizing that everyone's experience is what it is, and their reactions to those life experiences make sense for them. So for some people, they might have what we see as maybe something that isn't that big of a deal. But for them, maybe it was, because there could have been other things happening in their life. Also, there's a lot that I think people sometimes put away in a package and box up that doesn't always come forward. And so they might say, well, this is because the divorce of my parents when I was 8 years old, and very much they could be impacted by that. But it could also be something else that they're not ready to access, or that period of time that's something that, maybe for them was a big deal. Maybe for other people, they can move through differently because of the way they're made up, their brain, their chemistry, or their experiences before that thing happened. Then it's what happened from that point to where they are now. And how does that sort of snowball the impacts as well? So I think it's really complicated, and it is hard to rate people on what is more traumatic than others. What is traumatic for me might not be traumatic for you, and vice versa. So I think, in terms of moving people past that, it's, looking at, well, what are your life goals? Who do you want to be as a person? What is getting in the way? And how can we help support you address those things that are getting in the way? Because you're at a place where you want to move forward. You probably don't want to go back to jail. How are we really going to start to work on those things, big and small, together, that are going to lead you toward what your vision for your life is, and how you want to be able to walk through the world, and how you want to feel when you walk through the world?
I was going to say, Kathy, within the tools you have to supervise someone, or the probation parole office does, How much flexibility is there to have a personalized approach with somebody?
I definitely believe that it's there. And, I think that doing this work, in making the investment to really understand somebody and get to know them and connect with them just is going to work better for both the PO and the person being supervised in the long run. It's a critical piece, that understanding of where they're coming from. I agree with all you said about trauma and it being really complicated. And it's really interesting how some people seem to have so much resilience after having gone through unfathomable situations. And I've always been interested in that. And I think it again goes back to the importance of the safe environment, that they can't begin to heal that until they feel safe in where they're at, to be able to either look at those things or move forward. And I think another important piece is that sometimes we were talking about establishing goals and what are people working towards, that sometimes they need help in envisioning that because they haven't ever seen it. And that's another, positive thing that someplace like Dismas can help provide, that this is what it's like to sit down and have dinner together, because sometimes people haven't had that experience.
I think we've all probably come across people in our lines of work where we'll say this person isn't ready for change, or maybe this person doesn't want change. What's the approach? Jail is very rarely a deterrent, but why isn't the behavior changing? It could be the traumas. When you have that person presented to you in your office, what are the steps? It was very difficult for me to manage. I didn't know what to do, because then it could become toxic to the remainder of the house in my position.
Right.
It's not as individualized.
My thinking is to just to kind of step back as far as you can and just find really small goals that you can both sort of agree that this is a good place to start, and to back it up to find, there's always going to be something that you can find to work on together, or to help that person be accountable to accepting responsibility for a particular thing. And if you can get buy-in at that level, then you can start to build on it.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
I think the other thing that we want to consider is that sometimes just maintaining is work in itself. And so though we are always hoping that people might continue to choose a goal that big or small, that gets them towards the person that they're hoping to be and become, and the person that they are, that sometimes we need to just leave space for that maintenance, right? For that ability for people to just settle into their new routines, their new habits. Because again, the brain does take a long time to heal. And it's important to be mindful that it might take longer for some people, and that we do have to just allow that maintenance for some people for a period of time and let it stick. It's like with all of us, right? If we're trying a new habit, I want to sleep more, or I want to walk every morning. It's hard work in the beginning. And then sometimes people just want to say, you know what, I've reached this goal and I'm going to stick here for a little bit until I start the hard work again of the next thing. And it allows people to feel success without the stress of having to do the next thing or the next thing or the next thing. So it's a balance.
Is it oversimplifying to say, if the goal is, to correct criminal behaviors or addiction or whatever, let's start as small as get up and make your bed in the morning. Is that a tangible thing? Is that what you're talking about?
I think it could be. Yeah. Absolutely. Just establishing routine, trying to bring down the chaos that sometimes people are used to living and functioning in, and that could be that small step.
Where's the crossover into dealing with addiction as a behavioral issue and then as a physical dependence issue? I think there's two different approaches we're going at the same time. In my experience, I'm not trained in either one, to be honest.
It's a big question, Jeff.
Yeah.
Gosh, my mind is going in 100 different directions right now on how to answer this.
Well, we'll let you warm up on that thought. Kathy's just the DOC's probation parole's approach to managing someone with addiction, and just not whether or not they're relapsing or not. What are the programs we try to steer them towards to address them?
I do feel like we're really lacking in resources in that regard. Since I've been doing this work, I've seen programs that, used to be 90 days, go down to 2 weeks. And that's not nearly enough time for somebody to even like detox and kind of come out of their fog to start to deal with, treating the addiction.
And I would argue that Dismas that's one of their biggest selling points. You have up to 2 years in sober living environment.
Right. I'm thinking of like in patient
we're not a treatment facility.
Yeah. Because I think people sometimes need that to get off on the right foot. But length of time is important, and that's corrections sometimes isn't really good about that because we just have people for a certain amount of time. And you think of healing trauma and treating addiction, and they come in your office and you're like, okay, you've got 9 months. So let's get started here. And that's like a lot to take in. And I think part of being successful is understanding that this kind of change takes time. Like you were saying, maybe it's just some time to kind of maintain and kind of de-escalate and then start to focus on where you're going to go.
And we've had people go off of supervision that we've both worked with, and we've had overdose deaths. And I feel bad about it. Like, what more could I have done? This is no longer encompassed in my job description, but I wish I could have helped a little bit more because we do build relationships. And it's tough. I mean, we do have a set time limit to help. In addressing addiction, I've observed, there's addressing the behavior, and sometimes it's just a social thing for some folks. And then there's the physical dependence. Like I think the body needs it to function for some. What's the crossover? Is it always separate? Is it always intertwined?
I think it always is intertwined. I mean, behavior stems from some sort of need that your body is telling you have, or your mind is telling you have, or your emotions are telling you have. It's interesting, though. I think I was getting a little caught up in behavior because, again, I think that it's important for us to consider how our larger systems are also set up that impact people as they're leaving incarceration or are starting to practice recovery or harm reduction for substance use disorder. And what I mean by that is, for example, if I'm an employer and I have an employee who keeps showing up late for work or is missing more days than I expect them to, or maybe isn't quite as clear-headed as I want them to be. And I'm not sure what those underlying reasons are. And I just sort of go to a punitive approach. It's not really understanding that, hey, maybe they're a little late because they have to get to the clinic every morning. Or maybe they're a little late because mornings are just really hard for them to get up and get going. Maybe they're a little foggy because they're on some sort of medication management and it's, we're working on the doses or something else has happened in their life. So I think that there's a lot to think about. And I also think about that when we talk about people who have a record, right? So, how do you get employment? How do you get housing? So for me, I often look, because I'm a public health professional, I look at the bigger systems and not necessarily at the individual as much. I think an individual's behavior makes sense in the system that they're navigating. And if we really want to help people be more supportive and guide them in a direction that, again, is our goal for them. Is it their goal? That's the first question. We have to look at how is the system built to support people in moving towards those healthier lifestyles?
To what would you attribute those that have been in jail and presumably sober for 4 years get out and use within a week? This has happened repeatedly. Are these questions getting too deep? I don't know.
Actually, Jeff, that's a really interesting question. I can speak to a little bit of the research that I did in my previous job back in Massachusetts. So a few things on that. One thing that people would tell us is that a lot of people felt stigma around the medication management. So if they're on Suboxone or other things that are provided through the jail, it's really amazing that across the country, so many jails really are building in those medication management and substance use disorder medication management programs. They're very important. We don't want people to feel uncomfortable. But a lot of people say that they felt pressured to be on it, or when they got out, they felt there was a stigma to being on the medication. So the second they're getting out, they're getting off that medication. Yes, it was helpful for me while I was here, but I want to be able to do this on my own. I don't want to rely. I don't want to. Sometimes we'll hear the phrase replace a drug for a drug, which can be pretty, I think, stigmatizing and harmful, but that's how people feel. So that's one thing they'll say, which is, I want to get out of jail and I want to get off my medication. The other thing is jail is pulling them out of their environment, which is what you were talking about too, Kathy. And when we put people back into a place where there isn't the structure anymore telling them what to do, when to do it, and they're able to completely make choices on their own, it's easy. Even after 4 years, it's so easy to fall back into patterns. And it's easy to fall back into the things that you're just used to doing, or you remember made you feel good even if the consequences weren't so great. Or some people come out curious. Can I handle it? Can I do this? And I also think, again, from the research that we were doing, we would hear that it is scary. As much as people do not want to be incarcerated, when they go to leave, a lot of them expressed fear of what is next for me. And when we have those big emotions, we could possibly turn to the things that we used before to cope with our big emotions. And I'm sure there's many other reasons as well, but that was some of the research that we were hearing.
I think we really underestimate that piece of when people leave. I'm sure you remember from the facility, that we look at it as like, yay, you're getting out and you must be so happy. And they are so overwhelmed and afraid and don't know where to really even begin.
And a lot of people act out a character, I found, those final couple weeks in jail. Mm-hmm. They do some things that you hadn't seen ever.
Right, yeah.
It was really interesting, the anxiety over the release.
Yeah.
And, that speaks, to Dismas and other programs. What happens to those that go back into unstable situations or it's feasible that some get released to homelessness.
Yes.
And what are they going to do? Well, there's always the haven,
Well, housing is a major issue in Vermont, and it is hard. I mean, housing is healthcare, and it is hard to be able to stick with healthy goals and healthy choices when you don't have a stable, steady roof over your head, or you don't have a network of people who you can lean on and trust to hold you when things are hard.
All right, let's change gears a little bit. I want to get back to the women's specific issues. Have you familiarized yourself with the women's Dismas house at all, or?
I have been there once. I actually just reached out to Heather again this morning because I was thinking of her and thinking about, coming here today. So I've been there once, and it's a lovely house.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah,
it's an enormous building. I don't know how to ask a question without being too generalized. What gender-specific issues do female offenders feel or go through upon release that's different than what we'd expect?
Well, I think, one of the important things in working with women is just understanding how relational they are. So pretty much...
Let me jump in quickly right there. In 2008, when I went to Montana Department of Corrections basic training, they actually trained me in dealing with female offenders that the worst thing you can do to a female inmate is give them the silent treatment, and they encourage that you do so.
They encourage that you did that?
Yeah.
Knowing that
if someone's acting
thing.
out, give them the silent treatment, walk away.
Oh, dear.
Like, okay.
That's not gender responsive, let me just say.
But go ahead, I'm sorry.
So I think, understanding that piece is important when women are living together. The importance of parenting, if that's, a place, something that they're returning to. I mean, we know that when men and women come into the system, that the women are much more likely to have been primary caregivers of the kids going into the facility. And oftentimes they don't have the support in the communities to somebody bringing the kids in, and because we have one facility, right? So if you're from Bennington and you're incarcerated in Burlington, then your mom probably can't drive the kids up there to see you too often. And so, that, and it's so much a part of their identity. So I think in returning to the community, and I've seen this from many women, that there's a lot to work through. It's another area where we think, oh yeah, you get to be with your kids again. Well, the reality might be that the kids are really angry at mom because she's been gone for 3 years, and that there's a lot that needs to happen. It's not, you just don't step back out and have your family all click back together again. So certainly the trauma that women, have experienced, and as we all know, that certainly is the case for men too, but different for women in that the trauma often continues into their adult life and often happens at the hands of people that are also supposed to be loving them and taking care of them, so that there's some nuances there. And it's another pressure, I think, that when women get out, do they go back to a partner who might have been abusive or controlling, who's been pressuring them to come back, or do they try and go to a safe space and make some different choices? And those are really hard because of the importance of relationships and sometimes, the dependency that's there.
How often are female offenses connected to a domestic relationship? Is it usually a household event? I'm just curious. Or are women acting
that is a
singularly?
Factor. Yeah. One of the things I've been working on is trying to bring in a new risk needs assessment for women, because everything in a correctional system is pretty much built for men. And we really missed the boat in looking at, women have different pathways that bring them into the justice system. And so we need to understand that better so we can treat those issues, which are just different than men. But on that assessment, one of the things it looks at is in committing your offense, was that with your partner? Was it with, whoever? It really breaks down relationships a lot more. And whether it's driving a getaway car when there's drug sale going on or using violence in a situation that's really more self-defense, there's a whole number of ways that their relationships can potentially be a part of why they committed a crime.
And I think, that can be true for a lot of criminal offenses. You got to look at the whole story of what happened, maybe more specifically women. I haven't had a lot of experience working with females. We did have Hartford Dismas House had co-ed housing for a little bit. And actually, I really enjoyed the experience. What the women there shared with me is they felt that they were even more punished than the men in the house. They feel like they were scrutinized on every move they made. They felt like in the jail they got written up for every minor infraction, whereas men may have just looked the other way.
That's very true. I mean, I think part of it is having a different expectation of women, that, talking like that or behaving that way is not ladylike, and you're going to get, written up or have that behavior addressed, whereas with men, it wouldn't be. We do see that in use of language and things like that women get written up for when a man saying the same thing would not be the case. And there's also the, because women want to ask why. Why do I have to follow that rule? Why are you giving me the cold shoulder or whatever it might be? And so sometimes they're asking a lot of questions, which gets annoying and get written up for things like, agitating and provoking, which if you look at agitating and provoking in a men's facility, the behaviors are probably going to be a lot more aggressive than just asking too many questions,
Well, and I think these are interesting questions to explore, because then it really begs the question of when women are transitioning out from incarceration and they're coming back to community, what can we do better to receive them? What can we do differently to receive them? Whether it's at Dismas House and at the women's specific home, or it's the community at large. Because I think you're right, Kathy. I mean, what you're describing mirrors our culture as a whole, right?
Yes, it does.
And it's definitely in a more profound and in a place where it's probably even a little bit more damaging, right? Because women have less control in that environment than they do when you're not incarcerated. But that really begs the question of how do we receive women back to our community differently, and thoughts around stigma and the extra stigma that women experience, especially if they're parents.
Right.
There's a lot I think we need to do as a community to bring folks back and make them, help them be successful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is your position new?
It existed about 8 years ago, but there hasn't been anyone in the position since then.
Because I'm curious if there's specialized training or people that have just women-specific caseloads because they have a better understanding, a better background for it. I mean, this could apply straight to the facility. Do the correctional officers in a women's facility have specific training to deal with such?
We actually just, currently at Chittenden, they're training their staff in safety matters, which is a curriculum for staff that work with women. So yes, that exists. This risk need assessment would be specialized training. And part of going through the training is learning a lot about gender responsive and trauma informed approaches and understanding those different pathways that women follow into the system.
So this is a relatively newer thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would imagine you're working with lots of other systems that can be equally traumatizing for women, like Department of Children and Families and other systems that they're involved in. That gets really complicated, I would imagine, as a service provider.
It's very complicated.
How do you do that? How do you work with other agencies? Maybe you're changing the philosophy, maybe they're not, or maybe you're on the same page, but knowing that when women are navigating multiple systems, that's a lot.
It is a lot. And, at the facility, they have an excellent program that with contracted staff from the Lund program up in Burlington, and it's called Kids Apart, and they do a lot to try and help maintain those relationships. And they also work quite a bit with DCF around, trying to help the women maintain their case plans or address things that they can while they're incarcerated.
So I think we've come a long way. I mean, it probably wasn't that long ago that women were held to the same standard as men. And furthermore, I mean, women are just smaller in stature. They're less physically imposing than some men that are in jail. And I imagine they got bullied to an extent by staff. It's a lot easier to tell a 5-foot woman what to do, 5-foot woman what to do than the 6'5" guy.
It certainly is, yeah.
Is there a different approach in managing female addiction to men, or is that universal?
Well, I think the trauma that they have experienced in their lives, is a direct connection to both substance abuse and mental health issues that come up. And so treating the trauma is important. And it sounds like you've done a lot of this in your career. It's so tricky because you have to be in a safe space and you have to have somebody that you're working with that, again, is going to be consistent and safe, and all these factors that need to be there that certainly don't present themselves in jail. And so how we treat trauma and then the other issues that come up because of it is complicated, I would say.
I think it's important for the medical community to understand the different physiologies of women and men as well. So if someone is accessing some sort of medication to help with their substance use, there has been a little bit of research around the differences in men and women physiologically on various medications. So just ensuring that medical providers are up to speed on the best approaches for women too, I think are important.
So trauma is a recurring issue here, and there's a severe shortage in available therapists. What do we do with that? I mean, I struggled with that at Dismas. I mean, I say, you had a relapse, you can stay here if you seek treatment. Go find a therapist. Oh, I can't find one. They're booking 3 months out. What do we do with that? Is there an answer?
That's a real problem, and I think it's something that the whole community needs to be invested in trying to fix that. I mean, just anecdotally, to me, it seems that COVID really set us back quite a bit in terms of mental health and available therapists, and people weren't seen for a while, and it creates a backlog. I think people left the field locally. It's very hard to find somebody that you can work with for a long time that takes Medicaid, that, all these other factors that they have to deal with.
Yeah, and it really is a bigger issue. I mean, when you look at the reimbursement rates for Medicaid versus private insurance, it can be a barrier to providers wanting to necessarily work with a population that's on Medicaid. So I think that there's a lot of work to do with the systems in general, for sure.
And to the person who's asking for help, it's probably hard for them to get to that step. And when they say, okay, we'll help you, but you got to wait, I imagine it makes them feel, not as important. And at some point they say, well, the hell with it.
Right. It's another reason that they, might feel like giving up and not, staying the course, because that's tough.
Yeah. And I think bringing people services to where they're at is important. Thinking about what models, instead of always asking people to go to the services, sometimes just getting out of bed is really hard, right? So people who are leaving incarceration, they're trying to form new routines. They're struggling with their mental health. They're struggling with their self-esteem. They're struggling potentially with substance use disorder or relapse or maintaining recovery. And then we expect people to get to all of these appointments at different times of day when they don't have transportation. And, I'm wondering how we can bring services to Dismas or to other places where people already are, so that it's not an extra barrier, so that it's, maybe I'd be willing to come from my room upstairs down to the living room or a private office area, but I can't today come from my room, get outside, take 3 buses, and make this a 4-hour trip for a 45-minute appointment.
And so I've pitched this idea twice before on this podcast, and I'm going to do it again. We don't have this in Vermont, and I want to know if they have this in Massachusetts. I grew up in Connecticut, and we do a mobile crisis unit where we meet people in crisis, in active relapse, having a mental health crisis. There's an avenue we can go down where we get services brought to you. An ambulance will show up with therapists and whatever. Do they have that in Massachusetts?
In theory, yes. It depends on what social service agency has that contract. There are a few counties or areas around here that have it, but it's often based on larger federal grants. It's not necessarily state funded. So there are, I think a little bit south to us and over in New Hampshire, they have those models that they've been starting. The other thing to plug is that the Hartford Police Department does have a social worker embedded, and her name is Kelsey, and she is really finding her grounding and finding her space. And so thinking about alternative models, again, how can a community respond? And also Hartford does have a peer mentor available as well through our local mental health agency, HCRS. So again, coming together as a community and saying, how do we respond as a community? We have these barriers, we have these limitations, and how can we get creative? Those are a couple of examples until we can get that mobile crisis unit, or until we can find ways for primary care to be more in the community and less, a brick and mortar or mental health services.
All right, I'll hit you with another thought I've said multiple times on this podcast. What do I do? Well, I guess I'm not in the house anymore, but when I was in the house, I struggled with, what do I do with the person in mental health crisis or active relapse at 1 a.m. on a Friday night? It's not Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 that we have these problems. And I found that I have no one to call. I mean, I have called the police and the ambulance came, but they'll refuse medical treatment, which is an option. They're not going to go back to jail for a relapse. So what do you do? How do I help this person? I mean, I've sat there for hours just monitoring. I'm not even trained for this.
Safety planning, what you're doing. I mean, that's, again, a failure of the system. I think it's around that safety planning. The emergency department can be just as traumatic for someone. So it's not always the answer, but I hear what you're saying because it feels like the only solution. It feels as if, staff don't necessarily have the expertise to be able to do that level of work without the formal systems in place. So I think doing that safety planning and just being with someone without judgment and knowing, it's amazing. I would be interested, Jeff, to have you reach back out to people, or maybe you have, and asked, what was it like for me to stay here with you for those few hours? And I know that's a big burden on your time, but for them, just imagine how amazing it made them feel to know that someone would go out of their way and take time out of probably your personal time to make sure they were safe and okay. Like, that sends a huge message of worth and value. It's not actually the solution we need. We need something more, but know that just you being there was a huge intervention for that person.
Yeah, I mean, it was 3 years ago, I had to come in at 2 a.m. on Christmas and just sit with this person who was in active relapse. He was hallucinating. He took probably 7 showers in 5 hours. And it was bad. And I had no answers. I had nothing to do. And I mean, I don't know if he recognized me or not. And that's fine. I was just there to help. But I still didn't know what to do. My only thought was, you're not dying on my watch. So what else can you do? And what happens to people that don't have a Jeff to show up and hang out for 6 hours on Christmas.
Yeah.
It's not
They
always
probably
good.
often don't make it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is why we need more supportive housing.
All right, Cherry, you have a list of questions. Well, if you didn't write it down, come up with one now. Let's close this out with a question from Cherry Sullivan.
Well, I'd be curious from both of you. We know that holding or having a label of being a formerly incarcerated person carries a lot of stigma, both internalized stigma and externalized stigma from the community. And so if you had, some advice for the community at large, people listening to this podcast who maybe don't work in the field, and maybe feel like they don't know what their role is in making a difference for community members we're bringing back from incarceration and welcoming to our community. What advice would you have for that sort of quote unquote average person on the street who's just a community member, and how they could make a difference in the lives of people who are transitioning from incarceration?
I would say that the only difference between the person in front of you that went to jail and the person next to him is that that person was in jail. It's a matter of perception. Don't treat anybody that was incarcerated or has any other ongoing issues any differently you would anybody else, because the reality is it's all throughout the community. You just may or may not know. The thing with Dismas is people were incarcerated there, and that's why we exist. That's our function. But the reality is there's hundreds of more in the community, 100 formerly incarcerated people that you just don't know about. So why would you act any differently?
And I think, getting involved in programs like Dismas and the Community Justice Center, volunteering and in those kind of places, I have never seen anybody kind of step in a volunteer role or, getting involved with these organizations that came away with anything other than much better understanding. And that whole thing of why do we stigmatize people like that? And it doesn't take anything to try, to get to know somebody and understand their story more fully. And if there was just more compassion in terms of interacting with people and not judging, it would make such a difference in our community and our world.
And as a matter of self-perception, when people get out of jail and arrive on Dismas's doorsteps, they feel the stigma and they self-identify as a criminal. Sometimes I'm an addict, I'm a whatever. But through time, they identify as being a part of Dismas, and it's a positive thing. And they're proud to share their story at some point. It's not always on the first day, which I've tried on this podcast, didn't work out great. But, if you give it time to adjust, people become proud of who they actually are and proud of where they currently are. And I think you grow from there. Thank you for listening to this episode of Going to Dismas. If you have any questions for future guests or any ideas of who you'd like to hear from, please email me at jeff@dismasofvt.org.
Thank you for listening to this Jam podcast. If you have found this program interesting and would like to find more Upper Valley content or learn how to produce your own media, please visit us at uvjam.org.